Campaign drifting is a plague upon humanity. It is something that game masters should vigilantly guard against, because once your campaign begins to drift, few things in the known universe can save it from a dire fate. I exaggerate, of course, and we should probably define what campaign drifting even is. If you've ever been in a D&D game that suffered from campaign drifting, then you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Campaign drifting is when a game session seems to drift from one adventure to the next without any overarching theme or story or goal to tie them together. Many times campaign drifting happens when players just randomly wander around the world looking for random stuff to do. Other times, campaign drifting happens because the game master does nothing to provide an overarching campaign through line. And the issue with campaign drifting is that most players enjoy the story that unfolds over the course of gameplay just as much as they enjoy the combats or the social interactions or other elements. And when you have campaign drifting, it's not so much that you don't have any story, but rather that the story tends to be far inferior to what it could have been. So you end up running a game that isn't as fun as it might be, and when it comes right down to it, solving for campaign drifting isn't really that hard. Hi, I'm Luke Hart, and on this channel I share my nearly 30 years of game master experience so that you can run amazing games that your players will love. Today we're talking about how to avoid campaign drifting by creating a core conflict in your campaign. This might also be referred to as a campaign through line or central campaign arc, which is the central theme or conflict that pervades most, if not all, of the entire campaign. Now, I was recently prepping for my Escape from the Fae game with my Ancient Dragon patrons, and something that took an inordinate amount of time was finding and setting up maps in Foundry VTT. If you run games online, you've likely found yourself in this same dilemma. Gotta get maps, gotta get them ready for play. And this is exactly why I recommend Chipeku Maps to folks. Look, you can get over 4,000 professionally made maps for just $5. They work in every VTT out there, and if you use Foundry VTT, they even come set up with walls and dynamic lighting. Believe me, this will save you so much prep time. These are some of the most beautiful fantasy maps that I've ever seen, and you can even get animated maps. You can become a Chipeku patron at the link down below and take the next step to transforming your game into something legendary. Now, the first step to setting up your central campaign arc is establishing what the core conflict of the campaign is. This is often called the central conceit, which is the inspiration for the entire story that the game master and players will tell as the campaign unfolds. The core conflict of a D&D campaign can be defined with a simple statement using one or more of the 5 W's and an H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And this simple statement that you're going to come up with will serve as the central principle around which you will construct your entire campaign. So let's break down how to create this core conflict statement. Number 1, ask who. First, ask yourself who is inciting the conflict. For me, I answer this question by thinking about which villain or monster I want to base the campaign around. Now, of course, this is going to be a high-level creature. For instance, if my campaign is going to go to level 20, I might want this monster to be a level 25 creature. But if my campaign is only going to go to level 10, then I might want the creature to be like level 12 or so. For instance, you may want to use an ancient red dragon as the main antagonist, and you plan to build your entire campaign around that creature. Now, another way that you can do this is that you can begin with an idea that deals with a less distinct who, such as an evil king against whom the characters will need to lead a rebellion. This gives you the freedom to decide what kind of creature the villain is as you further develop your campaign concept or as the story unfolds. This also gives you the flexibility to adjust the creature type based on the characters and their backstories. Something I did in my Sword Coast Guard campaign is that the main villain, Lord Paxton, was completely undefined for much of the campaign. It was only once the characters had reached like level 12 or so that I narrowed down Lord Paxton to being an ascended storm giant. And even then, I didn't know what stat block I would be using. I didn't actually choose the specific stat block or details of Lord Paxton until I was prepping the final adventure where the characters would confront Lord Paxton in a final showdown. Number 2, ask what. Next, ask yourself what the main villain is trying to accomplish. Many times this question is framed as, now that you know who the villain is, what do they want? But you don't actually need to know who the villain is to answer this question, because as we mentioned previously, you might have left the main villain as being a little nebulous. The what that we are answering with this question is simply the goal, and the main antagonist can be defined by the goal just as easily as the goal can be defined by the antagonist. For example, you may want to run your campaign based around the threat of the great old ones returning to the world to devour all life. Or if we go back to our ancient red dragon example, you may decide that its goal is to ascend beyond mortality to become an avatar of its dark goddess. Or based on the idea of an evil king that the characters will rebel against, the goal may be as simple as squashing the rebellion and remaining in power. Number 3, ask why. The third question you need to ask of your villain is why they are doing it. This why defines the villain's motivations, the reasons that they're trying to achieve their goal. Now, here's the thing. The why often appears obvious at first, but a good why has more to it. It has a deeper level to it. In our red dragon example, it might be easy to say that the dragon wants to become an avatar of the goddess because it craves power. However, it's far more interesting to say that the dragon wants to transcend mortality because it has learned of a prophecy that foretells its death. This prophecy speaks of a gold dragon who currently slumbers but will awaken on the first day of winter. Thus, the ancient red dragon is seeking power not for power's sake, but to protect its own existence. In our example with the rebellion, the motivation for the king wanting to retain his power may seem obvious. They don't want to lose their power. However, what if there is a deeper, secret motivation? What if the king originally came to power through a pact it made with an archdevil? And the terms of that pact state that when the king loses control of his city, the archdevil will come to claim the city for itself. So the king is protecting his own power, yes, but he is also trying to protect everyone in the city from this archdevil. Number 4, ask when. The next question you want to ask yourself is, when does the goal need to be achieved? Now, this when could mean a few different things. When could be a deadline for the villain to achieve their goal. However, a better way to implement this, I believe, would be to have the win represent a deadline for the characters. What if there were a certain date by which the characters had to stop the villain? Or what if they needed to stop the villain before a specific event occurred? Now, while a villain's goal doesn't always have to have a deadline by when it needs to be achieved, a good win creates a clock for the characters because having a deadline increases drama and tension, and ultimately those lead to more enjoyable games and more fulfilling stories. For example, our red dragon may only be able to complete the ritual of ascension on the winter solstice. Or the longer the rebellion continues, the more likely that the archdevil is going to return and wrest the city out of the king's hands. By the way, if you're finding this information useful, please give me a thumbs up and share this video with a fellow game master. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, why not subscribe while you're at it? I'll tell you why, Luke. I'll tell you why. Number 5, ask where. Now, the game master's first spark of an idea might actually begin here. It's just as easy to be inspired to run a campaign based on a game setting as it is a villain or monster. For instance, when I was getting ready for my Pathfinder 2 campaign, Thieves Abound, I was planning on running the campaign in the Eberron campaign setting. And as I was reading through the different geographical locations in that setting, for some reason the Marar Hold stuck out to me. For whatever reason, I just liked that location. So I decided that I was going to run my campaign there. And then at that point, I had to ask myself, who the main villain was going to be. Now, the where should inspire ideas such as the environment, creatures that live there, and the like. However, it should not limit the game master or player's freedom to explore the parts of the locale that interest them. For example, a campaign that takes place in the River Kingdoms of Golarion may include adventures where the characters travel to strange lands of Numeria or the twisted theocracy of Razmaran. Likewise, a campaign that takes place in the Frozen North could include an adventure that requires the characters to travel to a mysterious jungle that exists in a magical tropical bubble that exists, everything exists, that exists around an ancient volcano in the otherwise Arctic environs. For my Thieves Abound campaign, I fully intend to present opportunities for the characters to travel to other parts of Eberron. I mean, there is so much cool stuff out there to explore and learn about that would almost seem to be shortchanging my players if they were not allowed to experience more that the Eberron campaign setting has to offer. Number 6, ask how. Next, you need to ask yourself how the villain intends to achieve their goal. In many cases, the how will be the source of the main conflict in the campaign. You see, a dragon who wants to become an avatar of their goddess before the winter solstice isn't necessarily a problem. If that dragon doesn't have a method for achieving their goal, they're not a threat to the world and there's no game to be played really. However, when the same dragon starts sending hordes of kobolds to steal an arcane tome from the city's library, or an army of lizard folk to raise a town in order to draw out the young silver dragon that's hiding there, well, that creates conflict. In a D&D or Pathfinder 2 game without conflict, it's not a game at all. Now, this how should start with the overarching how of the entire campaign, but it should also provide a framework for all the little hows that will inspire the smaller adventures that make up the campaign. For instance, in order to ascend to Avatar status, the Red Dragon may need to sacrifice one of every kind of metallic dragon over the course of the campaign. And to accomplish that, the Red Dragon will need to gather minions to acquire an ancient tome. An ancient tome that contains the rituals required for the ascension. Find metallic dragons to sacrifice, capture those dragons, and then transport them to locations where they will be sacrificed. And all those items can be sources of specific adventures throughout the campaign. Bring it all together. And now that you have at least a few of the 5 whys and an H identified, the core conflict statement can be produced. For example, an ancient red dragon wants to ascend to become an avatar of its dark goddess by sacrificing 5 metallic dragons when the stars align on the winter solstice. So now that you have this core conflict statement, it will serve as the central principle around which you will construct the entire campaign. Now, there may be some unrelated side quests or character backstory side quests. However, how that central principle creates conflict in the world and what can be done to prevent it is the motivation behind all the central campaign adventures. And using that central principle, you can flesh out the campaign's major milestones, minor villains, and the creatures and adventures that get the characters from their first adventure at level 1 to the campaign's climax at level 10, 15, or 20. So your next step is to begin fleshing out some of the details of your campaign. And we're going to go over some of the questions you can ask yourself and the steps to do this. However, let me insert a warning right here. It will be very easy for you to get lost in the weeds and overplan at this point. And this can either lead you to doing a lot of work that never gets used, or worse, railroading to get the characters to do what needs to be done to tell the story. So my suggestion is to not overdo it. Focus on planning your first adventure, though you may want to look ahead for types of creatures that you want to use in the future and so forth. Just don't get crazy. How is conflict created? We touched on this briefly already, but something that is very important for you to ask yourself is, how do the villains and methods and goals create conflict in the world? Remember, if your villain does not create any conflict, then there's no reason for the characters to get involved, and you don't have a game or a campaign at that point. Now remember that you as the game master are going to have the high level picture of how the villain and all his minions are creating problems in the world. However, your players don't need to know everything. Instead, reveal only a little bit to them. They really only need to know the problem that is being caused for the first adventure that they're going to go on. You see, you don't want to reveal too much of the villain's plans too early on. Not only does this ruin mystery and suspense, but it could also paint yourself into a corner. The moment you reveal information is the moment that you can't really change it. And there are advantages to leaving things undefined so that you can change them in the future as needed. Furthermore, if you take the focus off from the current adventure, the players might get sidetracked, or they might try to solve the entire campaign before they even take their first steps. Imagine if at level 1, your characters march off to the ancient red dragon's lair to take care of business. That would probably be a short campaign, wouldn't it? Instead, at level 1, all the characters need to know about are the kobolds that broke into the library and stole an ancient tome that must be recovered. Furthermore, the very first adventure of your campaign may or may not even be about the central campaign arc. I personally prefer to get right at it, but other game masters like to start with something unrelated and then reveal the central campaign conflict a little later. If you're running a shorter campaign, I would suggest jumping right into the core conflict. However, if your campaign is longer, then you have more flexibility. Now, if you're wondering what adventures should even make up your campaign, there's a fairly easy way to go about determining that. Basically, you want to take your core conflict statement and figure out the steps that the villain needs to accomplish accomplish in order to succeed at their goal. And then basically each of those steps can be an adventure that the characters will go on to thwart the villain. In our example of the Ancient Red Dragon, it must acquire an ancient tome and abduct one of each of the types of metallic dragons. Those are all things that you can create adventures around. What are the minions doing? The next thing that I like to ask myself is who the villain's minions are, and how will the villain use them to achieve his goal. Now, some game masters are going to tell you to pick minions that will make sense for the villain, and this is good advice because it will help your adventures and campaigns seem thematically related. However, don't limit yourself by that advice. You can easily think of a reason that devils are working with the Red Dragon, even if it doesn't seem like the most obvious choice at first. In fact, sometimes turning expectations on their head is more interesting. Now, an Archdevil has access to devils of all challenge levels. However, an adventure where the main enemies are angels that the devil has tricked into serving its purpose makes for an unexpected twist with interesting options for how to approach the challenge. Will the characters just slaughter the angels, or will they try to figure out a way to show the angels what's really going on and thus turning them to their side? And yet, at the same time, there are plenty of reasons to use creatures that are thematically related to the main antagonist. If you have kobolds and lizard folk in the early adventures, that can foreshadow the possibility of a dragon. Scum and faceless stalkers might make players start to worry about the imminent arrival of an aboleth. You see, foreshadowing is a powerful tool. However, the most important consideration, in my opinion, is that you should choose minions and monsters that you want to use, creatures that will be fun for you. Remember, as the game master, you are allowed to have fun. In fact, if you ever get bored and stop having fun, chances are your campaign will die soon after. So now that you have your minions figured out, all that remains is to determine what the minions are doing in order to help the main antagonist achieve their goal. Because it's their actions that are going to form the backbone of the early adventures that your group is going to go on. How are the characters involved? All your campaign planning is for nothing if the characters never get involved with the central conflict. So you need to ask yourself what motivates the characters to get involved. Is one of the characters a mercenary who's only interested in money? Is one of the characters a farm boy inspired by stories of his heroic father who wants to do something good in the world? Is one of the characters a princess who wants to regain the respect of her family after falling from grace? Using these motivations to hook the characters will also show your players that you're paying attention to their characters, and that will help hook them as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with simply creating adventures in a campaign conflict that rely on the social contract. That is, the characters are expected to go solve the problem because the game master put the problem there. However, the less you can rely on that and the more you can appeal to the character's desires or your player's desires, the more compelling your game will be. And one of the things you can do in this regard is to weave the characters' backstories into the core conflict. If possible, take elements of the characters' backstories and tie them directly into the core conflict. For instance, a cloistered cleric who has spent the majority of their life in a monastery might be seeking to recover lost tomes. And one of those lost tomes is the one the dragon needs to ascend to demigodhood. Or a peasant hero may learn that their heroic deceased father is secretly the villain's most powerful lieutenant. My big warning here, though, is to be careful not to tie a character into the core conflict so completely that you need to keep that character alive. Avoid putting yourself in a situation where plot armor becomes a necessity. Look for examples. Now, if you're still a bit hazy on what essential conflict is or what your essential conflict might even look like in your game, my suggestion is to look for and study examples. The first place that you can find examples is published campaigns. For instance, you might pick up Into the Fae off the Lair store and see how I created the essential conflict for that campaign. Or if you play Pathfinder 2, grab an adventure path. This is not an adventure path, obviously. I don't actually own any physical books of adventure paths from Pathfinder 2. You can also look at inspirational media. Many RPGs draw inspiration from one or more novels or novel series, television series or films, or series of films. Sometimes all of the above. There are countless examples of great science fiction and fantasy series that have been inspirational for games, and many game systems are licensed from a specific source, such as the Star Wars and Star Trek RPGs. Movies are also great examples of shorter campaigns, and some films are created in trilogies that demonstrate how a core thread can move through several adventures. Star Wars and Lord of the Rings are good examples of this. Standalone movies should generally be viewed as examples of how a single adventure or one-shot might function. Literature is another excellent place to look for examples. In fact, novels tend to go into more detail than a film or series of films, and many stories, especially genre stories, are told across multiple novels. The Hobbit and the Lord of Rings trilogy are a masterclass in using a core conflict across a long campaign. And right now, I'm reading Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, which is fantastic. I also really enjoy the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan and the Song of Ice and Fire by R.R. Martin. But that's just what I think. How do you craft a campaign's central conflict? And don't forget to check out Chapeku and get thousands of amazing fantasy maps for just $5. Now, if you'd like to learn how to implement social combat in your games, watch this video right here. And until next time, happy game mastering.